We'd like to thank our listeners for joining our program. We'd like to start the SPF-sponsored SPF China Observer Open Forum. We'd like to thank you for joining our program, the SPF-sponsored SPF China Observer Open Program. Draw a clear line with Putin's Russia is the title of our program today. We have from University of Tokyo, Professor Akio Takahara and Professor Kazuyuki Suwa from the University of Shizuoka. At the end of March, we had an article contributed by Professor Suwa, and he said that China has made a mistake in responding to the Ukraine crisis. So he advised China to draw a clear line with Putin's Russia, and that was an appeal that he made. Today, China's mistake is what we want to discuss. What kind of a mistake was it? How does China perceive this, and how has China responded? That is the central theme of Professor Suwa's talk. And after that, we'd like to have discussions with Professor Takahara. So over to you, sir, Professor Suwa. Based on the article he has contributed, we'd like to have a briefing. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Suwa. Thank you for your kind introduction. I hope that you will bear with me for a little while. I would like to spend the first 20 minutes or so for my presentation. And I would like to use some slides in the course of my presentation. This is the interpreter. Professor Suwa's connection voice is not coming through. We're not able to hear Professor Suwa's voice. We are not able to hear Professor Suwa's voice. Please bear with us. Please bear with us. We are not able to hear Professor Suwa's voice. This is the interpreter. This is the interpreter. We are not able to hear Professor Suwa's voice. Please bear with us. We are correcting this. We are rectifying this situation. Please bear with us. This is the voice of the interpreter. There is a technical issue. We are rectifying the problem. Please bear with us. Please bear with us. We are not able to hear the voice of Professor Suwa. Please bear with us. Please bear with us. We are rectifying the situation. So we'd like to resume. We'd like to resume. The current challenge for China is economic growth and to secure stable domestic stability. They need to secure that. But then, the United States is trying to prevent that situation. From about 2018, we had Trump and Biden. The two administrations under these two presidents have taken a very severe attitude vis-a-vis China. So in order to counter the United States, China has found it necessary to reinforce their relationship with Russia. So against the backdrop, that China has decided to support Russia in this current situation. To be specific, on February 24th, at the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympic Games, Mr. Xi Jinping met Putin. And at that juncture, they came up with a joint statement saying that they are against further enlargement of NATO, and that there is no sanctuary or there is no limitation to their friendship. So by doing this, they expressed their position of opposing the position taken by the United States and Europe. But as a result, this has served to narrow down the diplomatic options on the part of China. I'm sure at that juncture, China did not anticipate that Russia would take such a hardline situation going subsequently. But initially, at the starting point, China has taken a position which ended up narrowing down their options subsequently. So we take a look at the series of responses made by China this time around. I think we can identify two clear bottom lines. And these bottom lines are very inward in nature. For example, placing China first, the China first policy. Mr. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, on March 1st, met with the foreign minister of Ukraine. This was 1 week after the start of the Russian aggression into Ukraine, and the situation was very, very severe at that time. But what did Mr. Wang Yi mention at that time? He expressed Chinese position on the security and safety of the Chinese nationals in Ukraine. That is the response made by Mr. Wang. So therefore, this represents China first position or China first policy. And also, later on, Mr. Wang met with the foreign minister of Spain. This was a phone conference. In the conference, he mentioned that China is not a party to the crisis and that he does not wish the sanctions to affect China. So therefore, this is not compatible with the Chinese policy of becoming a responsible nation. Now, on the other hand, as far as China is concerned, are they completely supporting Russia 100%? That is not the case. They are not rendering 100% support to Russia. That is not the case either. For example, they're calling for self-restraint on the part of relevant countries, inclusive of Russia, and they've also used terms like the situation right now isn't what they want to see, and they're offering emergency support as well. So by taking these responses, the Chinese response may not be totally positive from the Russian perspective. So that is the situation, and also, they have to be mindful of the domestic opinion within China, which is critical to Russia, although that view may not be the majority at this moment. So, and any responses in their social media network that criticizes Chinese policy will be deleted immediately. But there is that view. Now, with regard to the Chinese Communist Party is very flexible, not only in terms of diplomatic policy, but they're very flexible. They're very versatile. So that flexibility of the party, there is still room for the party to exercise that flexibility going forward. So based on these several factors, as far as China is concerned, maybe there is hope that China could correct course going forward. So changing course means weakening their support to Russia gradually. So against this overall backdrop, what can Japan do? Japan should request such approaches to be taken by China. So why not host a foreign ministerial meeting between Japan and China in order to realize this? Now the current foreign minister, Minister Hayashi, before he was appointed as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, he was the chairman of the Parliamentary League for the Friendship of Japan and China. And I think he would like to see friendship between the two nations. So putting aside the government response, the government position, perhaps maybe behind the scenes, there's room for him to have some sort of discussions. So let me turn to the next slide. Now, my paper came out 1 month ago. So what has been some of the changes since my paper came out? In a nutshell, the China's support to Russia and China's assistance and support to Russia has remained unchanged. Maybe it could be that their support and assistance is even stronger. On April 24th, there was a forum, and Xi Jinping made a lecture at this forum. And although he did not specify the name, he was very critical about the United States, although he did not specify U.S. as such. Now, CCTV, this is the central television station for China, and they have what is called the Xinwen Lian. Shinwen Lianbo. This is a nationwide news program, Shinwen Lianbo. And in this nationwide news, every day they would report about the situation in Ukraine. And they followed the consistent theme. It's a repetition of the consistent theme, which is that any attacks conducted by the Russian forces are only limited to the military facilities. So this is the line followed by Russia. And also, they do not make any references to the horrendous situation in Ukraine. So the horrendous situation faced by the people of Ukraine are never covered in this nationwide news in China. And why do the Russians need to attack Ukraine? That is because the Ukrainians are able to receive supplies of weapons by West. And that is the driver of the military attack by Ukraine, according to China. And the Chinese media report that the experts and the academia in the G7 and in the Western countries actually criticize the position taken by their own nations. It's very difficult to gauge to what extent such news is being received by the public of China, but I think there is a certain amount of influence from these media reports by the Chinese television. So I would like to raise some issues vis-a-vis the positions taken by the Chinese government and by the media. The first is what I mentioned earlier. China has said that it seeks to be a responsible nation. And China has always stated that they want to play a role as a responsible nation. But then over the past 2 months, when we take a look at the Chinese response for the past 2 months, it does not seem to be the case. It does not seem to be the case. They don't want to be a responsible nation, it seems. And also, although China has shied away from direct criticism of Ukraine, but at the same time, they are not offering any assistance to Ukraine either. But there's the issue of Belt and Road Initiative. And Ukraine has been a friendly nation for China. But then China has not treated Ukraine as a friendly nation. Is that appropriate? That's the second point I wish to raise. And the third point, China has avoided any assessment of the conduct carried out by Russia. Isn't that because they are aware that Russia is in the wrong? For example, in the Chinese Foreign Ministry's press conference, when asked to assess the Russian actions, they did not give direct response. They simply say that it's the U.S.'s fault. That's what they say. When the United States caused a war in Iraq or in Afghanistan, they were involved in such wars, so they did not want to be criticized by the United States who engaged in such wars. That's what the Chinese say. So they're treating the actions taken by Russia and actions taken by the United States at the same level. So therefore, they are avoiding any direct discussion on this matter. That type of response taken by China, as I mentioned earlier, is not really befitting a nation who aims to be a responsible nation. That is my impression. So let me go on to the final part of my talk. Let's turn to my final slide. Thank you. So let me now talk about the outlook, prospects, as well as the challenges ahead. Now, in my paper, I did not talk about the prospects intentionally. This was intentional on my part. I thought that I should indicate some prospects for the future, but at that time, rather than talk about what should be, I felt that I should focus on my anger, if you will, vis-a-vis to Russia and China. So therefore, I did not express any thoughts about the prospects when I wrote my paper a couple months ago. And as far as the prospects are concerned, over the short term, China will probably make an effort to avoid any direct criticism to them, and that they will continue to support Russia, although they will try to avoid any direct criticisms being levied against China itself. So if you want China to take certain action, if you make a direct request for them to take certain actions, they'll probably not be amenable. So therefore, it's a matter of providing, it's a matter of appropriate explanation. So I think the other way is to indicate that what they're doing vis-a-vis Russia and what they're doing vis-a-vis Ukraine is not desirable for them. That's the approach taken. That's the approach that should be taken to Russia. So whether or not we can do this really rests on whether or not we'll be able to provide an appropriate explanation to them. Now, the communists, we have a situation where we have a one-party communist rule in China, and Mr. Xi Jinping has a great authority. Over the past month or so, I believe the Chinese position has been able to gain strong support domestically. This is not propaganda. I think majority of the public in China do support the current government under Xi Jinping. So therefore, depending on how we put the package together, I think it would be possible for us to encourage them to change their course eventually. So that being the case, I have some sort of proposals to be put forward to the Chinese government. First, we hope that China will really have the resolve to lead the creation of new international order in the post-Ukraine crisis phase. They have the ability to do that. So what type of international order are we talking about in the post-Ukraine crisis? It should not be based on cooperation between Russia and China. If in one way or another Russia were to declare victory, the influence rather, and the power of Russia in international community afterwards will decline, will wane. So is it positive? Is it advantageous for China to cooperate with such a nation? We're going to give that matter a thought. That's another element we could put forward. Yes, it might be difficult, and we cannot exclude Russia. But I believe, based on the premise that Russia's influence will severely decline, we should encourage China to maintain a certain distance. That's the direction that should be considered. Now, right now, both China and Russia claim that they have the best possible relationship right now. But then you have to remember that their opponents are on the same boat. So therefore, I believe the decision that I encourage is not a difficult one for China to make. And also, it might be difficult to improve ties with the United States over the short to medium term. But then in terms of its relationship with the United States, China should not allow their relationship with the EU and Europe to worsen. Now, this is not what I expect, but I believe that it's important that a certain level of positive relationship be made with EU, because this will help to further expand options on the part of the Chinese. And last but not least, I made reference to Japan. So what should Japan do? What about Japan? When we consider Japan-China relationship going forward, it is not all pleasant. But against the backdrop, if we are to further improve and expand relations between Japan and China, what type of image do we have? It's competition, confrontation, and cooperation. Yes, we do have issues such as Senkaku Island. We should take a resolute position. We should face China. Maybe that's an appropriate way. We should face China squarely. But on the other hand, we should cooperate with China where possible. So, confrontation and cooperation. At the same time, we need positive competition as well. So therefore, squarely facing one another on the one hand, but then cooperating with another. And based on that phase, we should embark on the positive competition phase. That's the structure we should be considering. Now, the argument which I have put forward, I'm sure will not be readily be received by the Chinese. But then, what are some of the factors that could impede flexibility on the part of the Chinese? First element is that they have strong confidence about the fact that they have excellent system. Based on the governance of the Communist Party, they are confident that they were able to achieve enormous domestic stability, and they have great confidence in their current regime. As I mentioned earlier, there is very widespread support by the people vis-a-vis the Xi Jinping government. So therefore, the Chinese are very confident about this. And based on this confidence, they may decide to render support to Russia at all costs. We cannot rule out such possibility. For example, they have the so-called zero COVID policy. They are very fixated on this zero COVID policy. Over the past 1 month, the situation in Shanghai has been quite challenging. And I think over the last day or so, they have embarked upon introducing regulations in Beijing as well. So the large city of Shanghai and the capital of Beijing, they are trying to achieve zero COVID, which can be very challenging. Are they going to fixate it on this policy going forward? Are they going to remain fixated on this policy? On the 18th, the head of the Commerce Department in China has made a following remark. He mentioned that if the current zero COVID-19 policy were to be relaxed, 2 million people could die over the next 1 year. That's the comment made by the commercial minister. I'm not sure whether or not this is a thought that is shared among the leadership, but maybe there's a possibility that such a very severe recognition is being shared by the leadership. If that is the case, they could not expect relaxation of the policy, which means that their policy vis-a-vis COVID will remain in place. And also 6 months later, there's going to be a party congress, which means that there's going to be a National Congress of the party, which means that the policy could remain in place for some time. So when we take a look at the Chinese response for the past month vis-a-vis the Russian aggression into Ukraine, there are many challenges. This is not positive for China itself. Maybe it's too late, but I do hope that they will realize more collaborative foreign policy and rectify their position so that they'll be in collaboration with the international community, because I believe this will be advantageous for China. But the elements that impede this as well. So I do understand that the situation can be challenging. That is all for my initial talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Suwa. Professor Suwa talked about the fact that China did not expect Russia to exert military power to the extent that they did, and so China misperceived. And China's misperception was that Russia's military incursion would not last this long. If this had ended within a short period of time, China would not have found itself in trouble, and they would have been in the position of a good-willed third party. And going forward, with regard to China's response, Professor Suwa said that China will probably continue to support Russia. For China, of foremost importance is competition with the United States and the issue related to Taiwan, which is of foremost interest to China. So cooperating with the United States would be extremely difficult for China. And furthermore, there are reasons why they have to support Putin. For one thing, President Putin, should he be toppled from power, then the next leader in Russia we'll have to prioritize rebuilding the economy, which has been reduced to tatters. And so for this purpose, if the United States and European countries, if Russia will improve relations with these countries, China may be isolated in the UN Security Council. That might happen. And if they refuse Putin's requests, Putin will be very angered. China's greatest rival is the United States, but they do not want to have other enemies in the background. And what is of foremost interest to them is that if Putin is forced to resign by the will of the people, then the society, domestic society's trends might have a fallout on China. And so that would be a nightmare. There are different perspectives. From this standpoint, Professor Suwa is advising China to improve relations with the EU and to keep a distance in terms of relations with Russia. That was the advice he gave. But to these points, of course, that is an ideal, but there may be discussions to the effect that this may be difficult. Already we have questions from our listeners. During his talk, the chat function can be used to raise questions, and we will take them up when we have our Q&A so that we can discuss. So that was a briefing by Professor Suwa. Now we'd like to turn to Professor Takahara to comment on China's response and what perspectives there may be, and what are the future prospects. These are things we hope that he will address. So over to you, Professor Takahara. What I wanted to say has been covered by Professor Suwa and Mr. Ohara for the most part. So what I have to contribute would be repetitive. To sort things out, I think there are two major issues. For one thing, why China is supporting Russia, and secondly, the policy of supporting Russia. Can China change that policy? I think it boils down to these 2 points. On the former point as to why China supports Russia, the first point, which I wish to indicate, is that on the 24th of February, the war broke out. And on the following day, on the 25th, Xi Jinping and Putin had a meeting. That's the second meeting in February. The first one took place in Beijing. It was a personal meeting, and the second one was a telephone conference. According to Russia's reports, Xi Jinping said something which was indeed very surprising, which was not reported much in Japan, and I'm wondering why. What Xi Jinping said, according to Russia, is that the leader of Russia, that is Putin, if the leader of Russia, we will respect the actions taken by Russia under a situation of crisis. And Russia says that Xi Jinping emphasize this. So China has committed to supporting Russia. The whole-scale aggression has been supported by Xi Jinping, in other words. Why is this? One of the reasons is, as is broadly believed, that Putin felt that the war would end in the 48 hours. And perhaps during the talks, maybe he said the war will end tomorrow. Maybe he said that to Xi Jinping. That might have been the case. So that might have been material for Xi Jinping to say what he did and make the decision that he did. But one major cause, and this has been pointed out by Professor Suwa and Mr. Ohara, competition with the United States. For Russia, that is a priority issue, I believe. So with the Biden administration, China expected maybe the pressure on China would be alleviated, but that was not the case. The Democracy Summit was organized, and so the pressure has increased. rather than decrease from the United States on China. So that's the backdrop, and that is the cause for the long China-Russia joint declaration. There has been a lot of talk about the Declaration on Human Rights, and UN Charter, observing the UN Charter has been mentioned at length. And they had their citizens read this and to declare that they were in the right. They made great efforts to emphasize that. In a certain sense, Chinese diplomacy, I think there's a Russianization of Chinese diplomacy. As to what this is that from several years ago, I'm a complete layman when it comes to Russia matters, but this is my impression that Russia's diplomacy is seen through the lens of competition with the United States. So the worldview is distorted to start out with. That was my impression. But recently, when we look at China, the same thing is happening. For example, the issue of Ukraine. When they try to understand and observe this, they view this through the competition with the United States, the lens of competition with the United States. So up until the point that the war broke out, the United States continued to warn the world that the war might break out. But China, until the very end, criticized this. There's a phrase that they always use, a standard phrase. The United States increases tension and brings panic and tries to instigate war. They are pouring oil into the fire, and they are irresponsible and immoral to make the criticism that they do. And so China continues to criticize the United States, as has been mentioned earlier. The United States and other countries send weapons to Ukraine. That's why the war continues, says China. So they focus on criticizing the United States. It's clearly distorted. Their worldview is clearly distorted, and that applies to their view on Japan. And they say that Japan is the poodle of the United States. And so China has a distorted view of the world. China and Russia have an area of convergence which is expanding. So Putin's worldview is explained by a certain Russian, and he says that Putin and his entourage, the inner circle, the five closest aides of Putin, have a view such that democracy is a failure. That's one point that they assert. And the US-led international order is facing a crisis. And the new order to emerge will be led by China and Russia. But avoid revolution is dangerous. It may happen that their government may be toppled, overturned, so they have to be cautious about this. That is their worldview. Xi Jinping has exactly that kind of worldview in operating the government and also in engaging in foreign relations. Russia and partner in competition with the United States, Russia has to be supported, and so that is of foremost importance to China, and that is why they are supporting Russia. That's the answer to the first question. The second discussion point is, can we change this? Is this a situation which can be changed? Professor Suwa made a very interesting assertion to the effect that this can be changed, and I think that is what he mentioned today. And because China is China, we can't say that the possibility is zero. Whatever the matter is, different things can happen, and that is China. And as mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party can be very flexible in its responses, and I agree with that. However, the mainstream thinking is that it's not easy And that is the view of many people, I believe. And there are various reasons why. And Professor Suwa probably can talk at length about this. But for one thing, it's related to why China supports Russia, the cause. Competition with the United States is a priority issue for China. And when this is the case, to cut off Russia, a partner, under what circumstances would this be possible? To remain close to Russia may prove disadvantageous in competition with the United States. Is there a situation where this happens? And we need to think about this. For the moment, however, it seems very difficult to conceive of such a situation. I think that's the majority view. But this may be a discussion point. And the other point is relation to the domestic situation. And Professor Suwa's point was that the domestic scene is very stable in China. Most of the citizens support Xi Jinping. And so maybe the leader can change policies all of a sudden, but if he's supported, he can manage. He can manage to do that. If he has enough support, he can change his policies very quickly. Now, as to what the actual situation is, we cannot visit China now, so it's very difficult to see and make decisions about the prevailing situation. For example, Shanghai, the lockdown in Shanghai. On the SNS in China, we can see pent-up frustration, and we can feel that by reading the SNS messages, the SMS messages. Is a method of communicating the struggles of the citizens. And so Beijing may suffer the same fate. And so all of a sudden they are hoarding, the residents of Beijing are hoarding food and other items. And now there's the party congress this year. This is a special year. So they want to avoid risk as much as possible. For example, a joint prosperity is common prosperity is something that have been asserting to create an equal society to alleviate disparities. In his talk, Xi Jinping talked about the real estate tax, and this year he said that they would not expand taxes because real estate tax is very unpopular and they don't want to pay that. It's very unpopular. So what is unpopular, they want to avoid. That is at least the judgment of this year on the part of the Chinese leadership. Stability is of foremost importance so that the party congress can take place successfully and so that Xi Jinping may be re-elected for a third term. And that is the first target and goal. So he's not 100% confident about the citizens' support for him. That is my impression. So changing policies, or if China says he will not support Putin, then the citizens will accuse him for having been mistaken in the past. In the past, China stressed the support for Putin, and then are you reversing that? That's what the citizens may say. So it may be difficult for Xi Jinping to reverse his policies regarding support of Putin at this point. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, sir, it's not just limited to Putin and Xi Jinping. When it comes to political leadership in authoritarian states, it's very difficult for the leadership of such states to admit their mistakes. Once they admit their mistake, then they would actually lose their authority. They are very concerned that their authority could be undermined. Now, the Chinese position vis-a-vis Taiwan, I believe, how will this change in terms of the response to the Ukraine situation? That's what I would like to talk about going forward. The Professor Suwa You talked about the Ukraine situation, and there was a phone conference between Biden and Xi Jinping, and also there was a meeting between the leadership of U.S. and China. And I believe you mentioned that the Chinese interest was primarily in relation to Taiwan. So for China, it's not Ukraine. Their point of interest is Taiwan. So when you take a look at the Chinese response to the Ukraine situation, what is the impression of the international community on this matter? And will this affect the actions and responses to be taken by China vis-a-vis Taiwan? Professor Suwa, Professor Takahara, if you could talk about these points, please. Could we start with you, Professor Suwa? Thank you very much for your question. Well, Professor Takahara and Mr. Ohara, you asked various questions. You raised various issues. I'd like to thank you for your comments. So first of all, I'd like to turn to the Russianization of the Chinese diplomacy, as mentioned by Professor Takahara. I totally agree with you. That's an excellent expression, actually. And as was pointed out by Ohara-san, Putin's Russia, if Putin's Russia were to disintegrate, then this would actually have an impact on China. I think that is also true. This could also cascade its way to China. But then China is very adept at this, very clever. If China is able to be very clever and astute, there's a possibility that they could actually avoid such a situation as well. So maybe it's a hope on our part. About 10 years ago, Gaddafi was brought down in Libya. And at that juncture, they were concerned about the safety of the Chinese nationals in Libya. And they carried out a major-scale operation to evacuate the Chinese nationals in Libya at that time. And more than 30,000 Chinese nationals were evacuated from Libya immediately. And afterwards, the Gaddafi government toppled. What did China say at that juncture? They mentioned that Gaddafi was not a friend. Until that point in time, China enjoyed a very close relationship with Gaddafi. But once Gaddafi was toppled, they said that Gaddafi was not a friend, that it was based on the choice made by the Libyan people. So that's one way to explain Chinese actions. I'm talking about the possibility here. Also, what about the domestic situation in China? When we consider the domestic situation in China, it may be difficult for the government to change its policy. That was the point made by Professor Takahara, and I do agree with that. Maybe this is actually an attempt for myself to convey my hope and views to the Chinese people. If we say it's difficult, if we say something's difficult, then the story's over. So I think we should always focus on the possibility. And I believe the situation has been evolving for the past 1 month. For example, with regard to COVID, for example. So if it turns out that zero COVID policy was seen to be a mistake on the part of the public, then the situation will change. And this could actually increase uncertainty on the part of the foundation for the government. And I'm expecting flexibility for diplomacy. I do understand, though, that it's difficult for the government to exercise flexibility when it comes to foreign policy. In relation to Taiwan, for China, Taiwan is a very important matter. And achieving unification with Taiwan is one matter which is there. And I believe they're trying to gain lessons when they take a look at the Russian aggression into Ukraine. But to what extent will they be rational? When Russia invaded Ukraine, I think rational thought was that they would not carry out aggression into Ukraine. Then what about China and Taiwan? China says that this is a domestic issue, but then for us, For those of us outside China, that is not a domestic issue. So then what should be done about this matter? I am concerned about what took place back in 2007. The U.S. military force, 2027. The U.S. military people said that there might be something that would take place in 2027. Now, 2 years ago, (2027) coincides with the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Liberation Army. And the Chinese government is saying that they want to achieve goals for 2027. What do these goals mean? Xi Jinping was in Fujian for a very long time. So he believes that he knows well about Taiwan and the Fujian province. So 2027. Yes, there is a level of uncertainty here, but if things go on the way they are, it is likely that the third term for Xi Jinping is quite high, which means that the end of the term will come in 2027. So if he wants to leave behind a historical legacy, he may consider something. So this is very vague and ambiguous, but that is the impression that I have. So will there be rational thought? Will they exercise rational thought when it comes to unification with Taiwan? I think there are very few options available now. If they take a soft stance vis-a-vis Taiwan, then the people will probably be opposed. That type of opinion poll will eventually emerge. So I think there's always a possibility that something could take place in 2027. But then, although we talk about so-called unification, there could be all different levels of so-called unification. So we must be mindful of the form of so-called unification. But by 2027, there might be possibility for they are trying to achieve unification. So I think we have to be mindful of that and carry out simulation, bearing in mind that scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Takahara, you have the floor. As Professor Suwa has just mentioned, a rational decision, it's a very important point as to whether a rational decision will be taken. With regard to Putin's all-out aggression of Ukraine, the domestic citizens in China, probably for the most part, did not expect this to happen. On the media, there are famous international experts on international relations, and they are realists, and they very explicitly said that this cannot happen. And here again, they said that the United States is instigating all of this, and I believe they were all surprised. And the reason why Putin waged this war, I do not know for sure, but it's probably removed from realism. It's a le sentiment as for being defeated in the Cold War, and this is a rebuttal for this. And that might be the cause of the start of the war. It may be a nationalism on the part of Russia as well. And so if a rational decision is made, there might have been deterrence to stop the war. And that's a very important factor. And the other point is that on the Chinese side, the circumstances on the Chinese side, if a rational decision cannot be taken, is there a situation that prevents a rational decision to be taken? We need to try to discern all of this going forward. But as of the present, for Xi Jinping to make an irrational decision, I surmise that this is not a situation where this could happen. But as I said earlier, there's no knowing what will happen with regard to China. All bets are off. So as to whether the situation will remain the same until 2027, there's always possibilities for anything. So we need to be very cautious. And I agree with that point. Thank you.
So we heard from the two speakers. You mentioned the term rational judgment. So rational for whom? That must be considered as well. Rational for whom? So Russian aggression into the Ukraine, from our perspective, was totally lacking in rationality. It was not rational at all. But then from a different perspective, maybe there may be people who believe that Russia acted in a rational manner. And also, based on the information gained by Putin, maybe that was a so-called rational action. So one question that emerges is this. In the case of political leadership with monopolistic and dictatorship authority, the longer their term, maybe the less accurate the information that they obtain. If one person were to make all the decisions, they have to be privy to all the information. So the amount of time that could be allocated for each event could be very small. So is such political leadership privy to accurate information? That, I believe, is the question. I think that's one of the factors why Mr. Putin miscalculated the situation. Maybe this leads to criticism that Putin that was led to take actions based on such misinformation. Now, Xi Jinping, in the 20th National Congress, Party Congress, is seeking a third term, likely. So the longer the term, maybe China's decision vis-a-vis aggression into Taiwan could become less rational going forward. That is a possibility. Now, the Chinese political leadership is different from the structure in Russia, but even in China, maybe there's a possibility that they could fall into the same mistake that Mr. Putin faced. I would like to ask these two gentlemen to respond to this question. So we start with Professor Takahara this time around. Professor Takahara. Thank you. I believe it is exactly as you pointed out. So when you have a small number of people making decisions based on one dictator, there are two problems here. First is the inconvenient truth is never conveyed to the top leadership. And the other issue, as we have already talked about, is that once they make a wrong decision, it's very difficult to rectify that miscalculation. I believe these are the two major issues on hand. So what you mentioned, Ohara-san, is a very significant concern. I do agree.
Thank you very much, Professor Suwa. Thank you. As Mr. Ohara said, the longer the tenure, the less accurate the information is made available to the person, and I think that's correct. Even if information is made available, and even if it's accurate, I don't think the leader will have room to make the right decision because he has so many issues that he has to deal with, and to make a correct decision is close to impossible, I think. So a high possibility is that inaccurate information is conveyed to him, and he makes a rational decision from his standpoint, but to our eyes, it's not rational at all. I think that's what happens. Thank you very much. We had interventions from the two gentlemen. The political situation in China is such that if a very strong leader remains for a long time, the situation is prone to becoming dangerous. I believe we have already received questions from listeners. A question to Professor Suwa. The purpose of the Chinese Communist Party, is it not to make the United States weak? And if that's the case, China cooperating with the United States or Europe, or maintaining a distance with Russia, would that not be difficult if that's the case? And to Professor Takahara, the Chinese Communist Party is maybe aiming at having a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. And there has been a simulation which has been conducted, an all-out nuclear war simulation. And China emerged out of this undamaged. So China and Russia's they perhaps are trying to draw out the direct confrontation between United States and Russia. Is this not the case? To the respective questions, perhaps we'd like to have answers. Professor Suwa, please.
Thank you very much. So what is the objective of the Chinese Communist Party? Is that to make U.S. weak and U.S. decline of the United States? If that is the case, they might be made difficult to maintain distance. That was the gist of the question. Well, I won't use the term decline or weakening, if you will. But winning against the United States, being victorious against the United States, that's what the Chinese are thinking, definitely. But in any event, if that is the case, reducing the distance between the West is going to be difficult. That is true. It is as you pointed out. But having said that, and again, at the risk of repeating myself, is that really positive for China? Is this really positive for China? If we consider the post-Ukraine crisis situation, is that really positive for China? They need to sit back and really consider this matter. At the end of the day, even if they maintain the goal of taking over the United States or exceeding the United States, I think there is a need. I think there's room to consider this situation. Thank you, Professor Takahara, please.
Yes. As to what setting the simulation was conducted is something that I'm not aware of. But if U.S.-Russia direct military confrontation, and in the ultimate end, a nuclear war, if that happens, when that happens, for the whole mankind, it will have a devastating consequences. And for that, when that happens, China cannot remain unscathed. So I can't believe China wishes that this would happen. So it's the form of way of confrontation, United States and Russia, to compete with one another and leading to attrition. That might not be bad for China. But in what way can that be realized? And when that happens, can China remain unscathed? Now, there are different conditions which have to be there for this route to become possible. That's my intuitive feeling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last question, the last point. This question it relates to the comment made by the two speakers that China and the Europeans should cooperate. Right now, China sees the United States as the greatest competitor. And as long as they focus on the competition with the United States, it might be difficult to expect China to take the overtures and compete and to collaborate with the U.S. and Europe. But still, if China were to cooperate with the U.S. and Europe, what would be the advantage? What would be the benefits for the Chinese? I think, Professor Suwa, you requested that China maintain distance with Russia and shorten the distance between U.S. and Europe. So if the two speakers could give a short response, I would appreciate it. Could we start with you, Professor Suwa? Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I do agree with the point made in your question. Just because China were to change, it doesn't mean that the U.S. will be willing to accept the change in the Chinese position. Now, you may criticize that I'm being too ideal. But when we took a look at the U.S.-China relationship, I always get the sense that they respect one another as a nation, as the public. I think there is a level of respect between the two nations. At the end of the day, there is that foundation. Maybe that has changed and evolved after Mr. Xi Jinping came to power. But I think there is that element between the bilateral relations between U.S. and China. So even if the relationship might not be very positive, I believe they're able to maintain the minimum level. So there's a sense of, if you will, trust between the two nations. So that is where I would put forward my expectation. Thank you. I'm being too ideal. I might be criticized as being too ideal. I'm aware of that.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahara, please. Yes, I'm sure everyone knows this already. It's like preaching to the choir. The world is very complex. And China is in competition with the United States, so they want to get Europe on their side, and different efforts are being made. That's one point. And the other point is that they're competing with the United States, but they are cooperating at the same time on many fronts. And so we should not turn our ways from this. So the United States and China think competition is of foremost importance, but there's a lot of cooperation on both sides, and we should look at that. We make sure we look at this. Thank you very much. To work on China to maintain a distance with Russia is what we discussed today. What would be China's response and perspective, and to maintain a distance with Russia, or for China to cooperate with the United States or Europe? We have discussed what is necessary for this to happen, and I believe that we need to deepen such discussions further. And at the same time, China's behavior on the Indo-Pacific is something that we need to take an interest in. Thank you very much for listening to SPF-sponsored SPF China Observer today. With this, we conclude the SPF-sponsored SPF China Observer Open Forum. We thank you for listening and your participation. Thank you.